Let's do part 2 of human development and faith development. The first lecture establishes the conceptual and theological foundation for understanding the relationship between human development and faith development, beginning with a review of the previous discussion on the human person. The first lecture introduces the central question that will guide the remainder of the course. If the human person develops psychologically, does faith likewise develop? We said that rather than treating faith as a static possession, scripture and Christian tradition present it as a lifelong journey of growth, conversion, and deepening communion with God. The lecture further proceeded by examining the concept of human development as lifelong, multidimensional, and contextual process encompassing biological, cognitive, emotional, social, moral, and existential dimensions. The latter part introduced two foundational theories whose work has profoundly influenced contemporary understanding of faith formation: Erik Erikson and John Piaget. In this lecture, we will move now to slide 19 and basically begin a new discussion of a new thinker, Lawrence Kohlberg. We now move from the development of the self in Erik Erikson and the development of thought in John Piaget to a third dimension of human development, the development of moral judgment. Every day, we make countless decisions. Some are simple: what to eat, what to wear, or how to spend our time. Others are far more significant. Should I tell the truth even if it costs me? Should I forgive someone who has hurt me? Should I obey an unjust authority? Should I remain faithful to my vocation despite suffering? These are not merely intellectual questions. They are moral ones. They concern not simply what we know, but how we choose. Lawrence Kohlberg devoted his life's work to understanding how people make decisions. His concern was not primarily whether people were moral or immoral. Rather, he asked a more fundamental question: how do human beings reason morally? Two people may arrive at exactly the same decision, but for entirely different reasons. Imagine two students who refrain from cheating during an examination. The first student does not cheat because he fears being caught and punished. The second refuses because cheating violates honesty and undermines personal integrity. The external action is identical. The moral reasoning is profoundly different. Kohlberg believed that maturity lies not merely in performing good actions, but in the quality of the reasoning that leads to those actions. For Christians, this is immediately relevant because the gospel consistently emphasizes not only external behavior, but also the condition of the heart. Jesus repeatedly challenged religious leaders whose outward actions appeared righteous, but their inner motivations remain disordered. Thus, Kohlberg helps us examine the maturation of conscience, while theology invites us to talk how conscience becomes open to the truth revealed by God. Let's look at Kohlberg's three level three levels of moral reasoning. Kohlberg proposed that moral reasoning develops through three progressively more mature levels. Each represents a different way of understanding what makes an action right or wrong. The first level is the pre-conventional level. Here, moral behavior is guided primarily by punishment and reward. Children often think this way. A child may say, stealing is wrong because I might get punished. Notice that the focus is not the moral quality of stealing itself. The focus is the consequence to oneself. The self remains at the center of moral concern. Many adults unfortunately never move beyond this level. They obey laws only because they fear penalties. They tell the truth only because lying may be discovered. They help others only when there is something to gain. The second level is the conventional level. Here, persons begin valuing social order, relationships, and community expectations. Instead of asking what happens to me, they begin asking what is expected of a good citizen, a good friend, a good parent, or a good Christian. Rules become important because they preserve community. Many responsible adults function primarily at this level. They fulfill duties, respect authority, and contribute positively to society. The third level is the post-conventional level. Here, individuals recognize universal moral principles that transcend social approval. They ask not simply, what does society expect, but what is truly just. History provides many examples. Martin Luther King Jr. challenged laws that legalized racial segregation. Oscar Romero spoke against political violence despite threats to his life. Thomas More refused to betray conscience even when ordered by the king. Oh, this reminds me, I have a beautiful film on this one. Maybe we can show it on Saturday, and it's entitled Of Gods and Men. It's about monks, of course, who lived in Argentina, or who lived in Argentina, who lived in what's the place? It's at the tip of my tongue. Who they lived in a Muslim place even if they were Christians. Maybe that's something to watch. Their decision, or Thomas More, who refused to betray conscience even when ordered by the king. Their decisions were not motivated by popularity, they were motivated by truth. Kohlberg therefore argues that genuine moral maturity enables a person to act according to objective principles even when society disagrees. This leads us to an understanding of conscience. At this point, theology both appreciates and corrects Kohlberg's theory. The Catechism beautifully describes conscience as man's most secret core and his sanctuary. There he is alone with God. CCC 1776. This statement is extraordinarily rich. Conscience is not simply an inner feeling. Neither is it merely personal opinion. Conscience is the place where the human person encounters the truth. The Church agrees with Kohlberg that conscience develops. No one is born with fully mature moral judgment. Children gradually learn honesty. Young people learn responsibility. Adults continue refining moral wisdom through experience, prayer, study, and reflection. Conscience, therefore, requires formation. John Paul II introduces an important qualification in veritatis splendor. He insists that conscience is not an autonomous power that invents good and evil. Rather, conscience discovers moral truth. This distinction is increasingly important today. Modern culture often says, if it feels right to me, then it is right. Christianity respectfully disagrees. Our feelings deserve attention, but they are not the final measure of morality. Truth exists independently of our preferences. The task of conscience is therefore not creative invention, but faithful recognition. Think of a navigator using a compass. The compass does not create north, it points toward north. Similarly, conscience does not manufacture truth, it directs us toward it. This understanding preserves both human freedom and objective morality. Freedom does not mean deciding what is true. Freedom means choosing the truth once it is recognized. This is the reason why we constantly said there's a difference between moral maturity and Christian holiness. Having appreciated Kohlberg's theory, we now ask an even deeper theological question. Is moral maturity the same as holiness? The answer is no. Moral maturity is certainly valuable. The ability to reason carefully, appreciate justice, and respect universal principles represents genuine human development. Genuine human development. Yet, Christianity proposes something beyond ethical sophistication. Holiness is not simply being a morally intelligent person. Holiness is becoming conformed to Christ. Notice what the slide says. The ultimate norm is not a principle, but a person. The ultimate norm is not a principle, but a person. This sentence captures the uniqueness of Christian morality. Ethical systems often ask, what is the right action? Christianity asks, what would Christ do? And how does Christ call me to love here and now? The saints illustrates this differently. Maximilian Kolbe freely offered his life for another prisoner at Auschwitz. From a purely utilitarian perspective, this decision appears irrational. Yet, from the perspective of Christian charity, it reveals the deepest truth about love. Similarly, Mother Teresa consistently served those whom society considered worthless. Her actions were not merely ethical calculations. They flowed from contemplation of Christ present in the poor. Therefore, Christian morality is never reduced to rule following. It is participation in the life of Christ. So the more a person resembles Christ in love, humility, mercy, justice, and self-giving, the more authentic Christian maturity becomes. This leads us to James Fowler. Having explored identity, cognition, and morality, we finally arrive at the central figure for this lecture, Week 2, Part 2, James Fowler. The progression we have followed has been intentional. Erikson showed us that the self develops. Piaget showed us that thinking develops. Kohlberg demonstrated that moral reasoning develops. Now, Fowler asks the question that motivated our entire discussion from the beginning. Does faith itself develop? This is a bold proposal. Many Christians instinctively think of faith as something one either has or does not have. Fowler suggests something different. Faith possesses recognizable structures that mature throughout life. This does not mean Christian doctrine changes, nor does it mean revelation evolves. Rather, it means that the human person's relationship to faith develops. Just as children and adults think differently, reason differently, and understand themselves differently, they also believe differently. This insight has an enormous influence upon religious education, pastoral ministry, seminary formation, and spiritual direction. Nevertheless, as we shall see later, Fowler's theory requires careful theological evaluation. The Church welcomes psychological insight while insisting that faith remains fundamentally a supernatural gift of grace. Thus, Fowler becomes an important conversation partner. Let's look at Fowler's groundbreaking work. What makes Fowler unique among developmental psychologists, unlike Erikson or Kohlberg, Fowler did not begin with personality or morality. He began directly with faith. However, Fowler deliberately used the word faith in a broad sense. For him, faith is not limited to Christianity or even religion. Faith refers to the way human beings organize meaning, trust, commitment, and ultimate concern. Every person, whether religious or not, ultimately trusts something. Some trust wealth, others trust science, some trust political ideologies, others trust personal success. Christians trust God revealed in Jesus Christ. Thus, Fowler argues that faith is universal because every human life is oriented towards something considered ultimately meaningful. Here we should notice both the strength and limitation of his theory. Its strength is that it recognizes faith as central to human existence. Its limitation, from a Catholic perspective, is that theological faith cannot simply be equated with generic human trust. Christian faith is not merely trust. It is a supernatural response to God's self-revelation made possible through grace. Therefore, Fowler's theory technically illuminates that human structure through which faith develops. But theology reminds us that grace, along those lines, grace, as we have seen, grace remains God's initiative. Fowler interestingly identified 6 stages of development. Today, we begin with the first 3, which corresponds largely with to childhood and adolescence, as you will see later on. So let's look at this one little by little, okay? So the first is intuitive, projective faith. Typical of early childhood, this stage is shaped by imagination, stories, symbols, and vivid images. Children imagine God through pictures, narratives, and emotionally powerful experiences. This is not childish foolishness. It is the appropriate way children first encounters transcendence, and therefore something that you have to pay attention to. Okay? Um, the second stage is the mythic literal stage, no? And it's called mythic literal stage because biblical stories are now understood concretely, no? Now they're understood concretely, and therefore Jonah was literally inside the whale. Noah's Ark is interpreted as primarily a historical narrative, which means, therefore, moral rules are clear and absolute. Authority comes largely from parents, teachers, and religious leaders. The child trusts because trusted adults believe. It's too literal. The third stage is synthetic conventional. These often characterizes adolescents and many adults. Faith becomes deeply connected to belonging. One believes because one's family, parish, school, or community believes. Beliefs are sincere. Commitment is genuine, yet many convictions remain relatively unexamined. This stage is neither false nor immature in a negative sense. In fact, most healthy communities require this shared identity. However, if faith is to mature further, there eventually comes a moment when inherited beliefs must become personally appropriated. Every mature Christian eventually encounters the question, do I simply believe because others believe? Or have I encountered Christ personally? That question will lead us naturally to Fowler's later stages, which describes the movement of faith from inherited toward the reflective, integrated, and ultimately self transcending one. So let's look at, so until this stage, this is simply adolescent, and then it starts maturing. No? Having examined Fowler's first three stages, we now turn to the stages that characterize mature adulthood. These stages are particularly important because they move from inherited faith towards personally appropriated faith, and eventually towards lives transformed by radical love. The fourth stage is called individuative reflective stage. This stage usually emerges during young adulthood. Although many people never fully enter it, here a person basically asks difficult questions. Why do I believe this? Do I believe it because my parents taught me or because I encountered God personally? What happens if some of my assumptions prove inadequate? Notice that this stage feels uncomfortable. Faith that once seemed simple becomes complicated. Long held certainties are eventually questioned. Many experiences revolve around spiritual dryness, intellectual struggle, or even periods of doubt. From Fowler's perspective, this questioning is not necessarily the collapse of faith. It may actually be the beginning of mature faith. The church has always recognized this reality. Augustine questioned before he believed. Thomas Aquinas spent his life asking difficult theological questions. Teresa of Calcutta experienced decades of spiritual dryness while remaining faithful. Questions, therefore, are not the enemies of faith. These honest questions are. The fifth stage is conjunctive faith. Here, people begin recognizing that reality is richer than simple either or thinking. They become comfortable with paradox. For example, Christ is fully God and fully human. God is transcendent, yet intimately present. Justice and mercy are not opposites, but are fulfilled together. The mature believer no longer fears mystery. Instead, mystery becomes an invitation to deeper contemplation. The sixth and final stage is universalizing faith. Fowler believed that very few individuals ever reach this level. Here's one entire life becomes, here one's entire life becomes radically centered upon universal compassion. Love is no longer limited by nationality, religion, race, or personal advantage. The person lives almost entirely for others. Fowler mentions figures such as Martin Luther King Jr., For Christians, we can think of Francis of Assisi, Mother Teresa, Oscar Romero, Maximilian Kolbe, or countless others whose lives became transparent to Christ. Their greatness does not consist in extraordinary intelligence. It consists in extraordinary love. And this is where we see Fowler's enduring contribution. At this point, we should ask why Fowler remains so influential more than 30 years or 40 years after publishing Stages of Faith. His greatest contribution can be summarized as faith possesses structure as well as content. This is an extraordinarily important insight. Two Christians may profess exactly the same creed. Both may attend Mass every day. Both may pray the Rosary faithfully. Both may affirm every article of Catholic doctrine, yet their relationship to those beliefs may be profoundly different. One may believe primarily because of family tradition, another because of intellectual conviction, another because of a deeply personal encounter with Christ, still another because decades of suffering have transformed those doctrines into lived reality. The content has not changed. The structure of faith has. Consider the Apostles' Creed. A child memorizes it. A seminarian studies its theological implications. An elderly monk who has spent 60 years praying it experiences it differently still. The words remain identical. The person's participation in those words changes. This enormous insight has enormous pastoral implications. It explains why identical homilies affect different parishioners differently, or why some students immediately grasp theological ideas while others require years. Why spiritual direction cannot simply offer identical advice to everyone. People are not merely at different stages. They stand at different developmental locations. Good pastoral ministry, therefore, accompanies persons according to where they actually are rather than where we wish them to be. Let's evaluate Fowler a bit. Having appreciated Fowler, we now ask a question that every Catholic theologian will consider. How does Fowler's theory relate to Catholic theology? The Church welcomes insights from psychology. In fact, modern Catholic theology has consistently encouraged dialogue with the human sciences. Psychology can illuminate the human conditions under which persons grow. It can identify patterns of development. It can describe how identity, cognition, morality, and faith ordinarily mature. These are genuine contributions. Yet psychology is not theology. Psychology studies observable human processes. Theology studies God's self revelation and humanity's response to divine grace. Therefore, the Church neither rejects Fowler nor accepts him uncritically. Instead, she enters into dialogue. This approach has always characterized Catholic tradition. Thomas Aquinas learned from Aristotle. Augustine drew insights from Plato. Contemporary theology engages psychology, sociology, neuroscience, and anthropology. Truth need not fear dialogue. Rather, every discipline contributes something valuable while remaining aware of its own limits. Thus, the question is no longer, is Fowler correct? The better question is, what aspects of Fowler illuminate Christian formation, and where does theology need to deepen or correct his conclusions? Let's clarify what Fowler gets right and what requires qualification. Every great theory possesses genuine strengths while also requiring careful clarification. Fowler's work is no exemption. First, what does Fowler get right? He corrects, he correctly observes that faith ordinarily develops. Children do not relate to God in the same manner as mature adults. Life experiences genuinely influence spiritual understanding. Suffering deepens prayer. Parenthood transforms one's appreciation of God's love. Forgiveness changes one's understanding of mercy. Pastoral experience confirms these repeatedly. Fowler also correctly recognizes that faith involves the entire person, not merely beliefs, but imagination, trust, identity, relationships, and commitment. These insights resonate strongly with Catholic anthropology. However, certain qualifications are necessary. First, concerns the nature of faith itself. For Fowler, faith is primarily a universal human structure of meaning making. For Catholic theology, theological faith is much more than this. Faith is first a gift of grace. As St. Paul teaches, for by grace you have been saved through faith. And this is not your own doing, it is the gift of God. Ephesians chapter 2, verse 8. Grace, therefore, is not the product of psychological maturation. No amount of human development can produce supernatural faith. Psychology may prepare the soil, but only God gives the seed. A second qualification concerns stages themselves. Development is rarely neat or linear. A deeply mature Christian may continue struggling emotionally. A brilliant theologian may remain morally immature. A saint may possess childlike simplicity rather than philosophical sophistication. Grace does not always follow psychological expectations. Therefore, developmental theories should remain descriptive rather than absolute. They help us understand patterns. They do not imprison every person within fixed categories. That's why we need to emphasize how there are limits to this. We have now reached the point where we ask the theological question. What exactly can Fowler explain, and what lies beyond the scope of his theory? Notice that these deliberately distinguishes description and explanation. The left side tells us what Fowler explains. His theory is genuinely valuable because it describes observable patterns of human development. It helps us understand how people appropriate beliefs differently across lifespan. It explains why a child, a university student, and an elderly believer may profess the same creed while relating to it in very different ways. It also reminds pastors, teachers, catechists, and formators that people are developmentally different. Consequently, pastoral ministry cannot adopt a one size fits all approach. In this sense, Fowler gives us an important pastoral sensitivity. He teaches us that people receive the gospel according to their developmental readiness. The task of the teacher is therefore not merely to transmit doctrine, but to accompany persons according to where they actually are. However, the right side of the slide introduces an equally important limitation. Fowler's theory cannot explain grace. Psychology can observe human development. It can describe how people think, mature, reason, or construct meaning. But psychology cannot explain why one person suddenly experiences conversion, why another receives the gift of faith, and why grace transforms a sinner into a saint. Grace belongs to theology because grace is God's free initiative. The slide summarizes this beautifully. Fowler maps the terrain. Grace determines the destination. And here you see the relationship between psychology and spirituality. Psychology tells us how people grow. Spirituality tells us who ultimately makes the growth possible. We move now to another set of people again. Our final chapter or section for this lecture, part 2 of week 2, introduces two scholars who extend the conversation beyond Fowler, Robert Keegan and Sharon Dallas Parks. Why is another chapter necessary? Because Fowler primarily examined faith. Keegan and Parks asks an even broader question. How does the human person continue to mature during adulthood? For many years, developmental psychology concentrated almost exclusively on childhood and adolescence. Yet, adulthood is not a period of developmental stability. Adults continue changing intellectually, emotionally, morally, socially, and spiritually. Consider your own experience. The questions you ask at 18 are not the same questions you ask at 35, 50, or 70. As we grow older, our concerns become more complex. We begin asking about vocation, family, leadership, responsibility, suffering, morality, and legacy. These questions require not merely more information, but a different level of consciousness. That's what Keegan and Parks seek to explain. Rather than asking only what people believe, they ask how people become capable of holding increasingly complex realities. This prepares us to understand adult development as an ongoing process rather than a completed achievement. Let's look at Robert Keegan. Robert Keegan's central insight is summarized in the title itself. The evolving self. The evolving self. Unlike many psychologists who study personality or beliefs, Keegan studies consciousness itself, the way people organize experience and construct meaning. Notice the three movements here. The first is external authority. At this stage, one's beliefs, values, and decisions are largely determined by external sources. Parents, teachers, religious leaders, institutions, and cultural expectations become the primary reference points. This is not necessarily a bad thing. Children need authority. Students need mentors. Seminarians need formation. But healthy development cannot remain permanently dependent upon external authority alone. The second stage is self-authorship. Here, individuals begin assuming responsibility for their own convictions. Instead of merely repeating what others have taught them, they ask, do I personally understand this? Do I freely embrace these commitments? This is not rebellion. It is mature appropriation. Authentic faith eventually becomes one's own. Finally comes self-transforming consciousness. Here, individuals recognize that even their own perspectives are limited. Rather than defending their views rigidly, they become capable of dialogue, humility, and continual learning. Notice the concluding statement on the slide. Mature believers become capable of dialogue, ambiguity, and contemplative openness because they have developed sufficient interior complexity to hold tension without collapsing into fear or simplistic certainty. This is not relativism. Rather, it is intellectual and spiritual humility. It's the recognition that truth is often richer than our first understanding of it. The next is Sharon Dallas Parks. Sharon Dallas Parks directs our attention to a very specific stage of life, emerging adulthood. This is particularly relevant for universities like Holy Angel because it includes most college students, graduate students, seminarians, and young professionals. According to Parks, these years are privileged because they are marked by life's deepest questions. Notice the three questions highlighted. The first asks, "Who am I?" This concerns identity. It includes vocation, relationships, personal values, and one's deepest sense of belonging. The second asks, "What am I called to become?" Notice the theological language. This is not merely about choosing a career, it concerns discernment. What gifts has God given me? How am I called to use them? What kind of person am I becoming? The third asks, "What world should I help create?" This question moves beyond the individual. It asks about moral vision. What kind of society should I contribute to? How do justice, compassion, solidarity, and service shape my professional life? Notice how these three questions correspond beautifully to the Christian understanding of vocation. Faith is never merely private. It shapes identity. It shapes purpose. It shapes one's responsibility toward the world. For Parks, these questions are not problems to solve quickly. They are lifelong companions that gradually deepen as persons mature. Lastly, for this group, for this week 2, part 2 lecture, let's look at these in relation to Holy Angel University as a formative community. Ex Corde Ecclesiae reminds us again that a Catholic university pursues its objectives through its formation of an authentic human community animated by the Spirit of Christ. This statement immediately changes how we understand higher education. A university is not simply a place where information is delivered. It is a community where persons are formed. Notice the contrast. On the left is Parks' insight. The questions students ask are simultaneously educational, psychological, spiritual. A student wondering about vocation is not merely asking an academic question. A student struggling with identity is not facing merely a psychological issue. A student seeking purpose is also engaging a spiritual question. The university, therefore, becomes the place where all these dimensions meet. On the right side is the Catholic vision. The university accompanies persons through the formation of wisdom. Its goal is not merely the transmission of knowledge, but the cultivation of lives capable of truth, responsibility, and faithful service. Knowledge alone is insufficient. A university must also help students become persons of character. This beautifully summarizes the entire lecture we have. Development is not simply about becoming more intelligent. It is about becoming more fully human. And from the perspective of Christian theology, becoming fully human ultimately means becoming more conformed to Christ. That is why Catholic education is not simply an educational enterprise. It is fundamentally a ministry of human formation, where psychology helps us understand how people grow, while theology reveals the ultimate horizon toward which that growth is directed. This is week 2, part 2 of your lectures. Thank you very much for listening, everyone.